Good morning and welcome to this morning's breakfast meeting organized by Civita, and also a warm welcome to all of you watching this event on streaming. My name is Mathilde Fasting and I will be today's moderator. We have invited Philippe Legrain, Harald Magnus Andreassen, Chief Economist at Swedbank, and Erik Grindheim, President of the European Movement in Norway and Fellow at Civita, to comment on Legrain's speech. Mr. Legrain is a British economist and writer, and he is also the author of the book European Spring: Why Economics and Politics Are in a Mess, and How to Put Them Right, which is the Financial Times called this book essential reading, and it's on its list on the best books for 2014. And you can order it in Norway by using Amazon. I think you have a copy here so you can show it to everyone. Legrain is also a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics European Institute, and he is a former advisor to the European Commission's President José Manuel Barroso from the period 2011 to 2014. We would like to address some of the issues in his last book and also ask him and the panel, can the European countries overcome their problems through political reforms? And also if the European Union is capable of stimulating new economic growth. Before the panel starts, I'll go through a few practical details. After the introductions, you will have the opportunity to ask questions and give short comments. I say maximum a minute. They should be clearly phrased in English, and I will repeat the questions since we don't have a microphone for the audience. Please speak up and remember to present yourself, as we are live streaming this event and clear sound is important. It's also possible to share your thoughts on Twitter or ask questions and use the hashtag #CivitaFrokost. But please remember to put your phones in silent mode. And we will end this session today 9:25 due to other engagements for the panelists. So we will ask you to stay until that time. And now I'll leave the floor to Philippe Legrain for his about 20-minute speech. The floor is yours.
Good morning. It's good to be back. I was here talking about immigration quite a few years ago, but it's good to be back all the same. Europe is in a terrible mess. The financial crisis that began in 2007 has become a much deeper economic and political one. Put it simply, most advanced European economies are struggling to deliver higher living standards for most people. And many Europeans no longer believe that either domestic politicians or the European Union are capable of delivering a brighter future, or even have their best interests at heart. So without radical reforms, Europe seems set for prolonged stagnation and political turmoil. I'm going to start by outlining the main problems that Europe faces, and then sketch out some possible solutions. It's a huge topic. I can't cover everything in 20 minutes, so I look forward to the question and answer session. Now, many of Europe's immediate problems are due to its failure to tackle the legacy of the financial crisis. It suffered the worst recession since the 1930s, and now the recovery is the weakest on record. And while the United States is not doing particularly well, every advanced economy in Europe has grown less than the United States since 2008. And only Norway, Switzerland, and Sweden even come close to America. The Eurozone as a whole is faring worse than Japan during its lost decade in the 1930s, and worse even than Europe in the 1930s. Its least bad performer, Germany, has grown by less than 4% in the past 7 years, and Greece has shrunk by 28%. Across Europe, many people's living standards have fallen far, not least the 24 million people in Europe who are unemployed. Unemployment is scarily high in many countries, especially among young people. A lost generation is in the making. And with the notable exception of Norway, Sweden, and Finland, which had their own banking crises 25 years ago, much of Europe now has zombie banks who extend their existing loans to zombie borrowers, but fail to lend to promising new ones. Much of Europe has crushing debts, household, corporate, financial, and of course, public. And because everyone is trying to repair their balance sheet at once, there is a huge shortfall of demand, of spending. So if you look at the Eurozone is trying to rely entirely on exports to the rest of the world in order to grow. But the Eurozone is too big and demand elsewhere too weak for that to generate a strong recovery. And while this year looks a bit brighter, it's mostly due to temporary factors. Now, on top of Europe's current problems, its future growth prospects seem poor because its demography is dismal and investment and productivity growth are weak. Europe, including Norway, is aging fast. Without migration, the EU's working age population is going to fall from 332 million this year to 303 million in 2030. And over the same period, the number of over 65s is going to soar from 96 million to 124 million. So merely in order to stand still, the economy would need increased investment and increased productivity. And yet if you look, both business and public investment are at historic lows. And since the turn of the century, productivity growth, which is the key to rising living standards, has also been poor. Again, compared to the United States is not doing particularly well by historical standards, but since the turn of the century, productivity growth has averaged 1.6% a year. Compared to that, Britain managed 1.1, France 0.9, Germany 0.8, and Norway only 0.3% a year. Only Sweden with 1.4 comes close to the US. And then, to make matters worse, in many countries, wages are failing to keep pace with this meager productivity growth. So allowing for inflation, and this is an incredible statistic, the average Briton earns the same as in 2003, and the average German the same as in 1992. And that, of course, leaves growth reliant either on domestic credit growth, in the case of Britain, or on exports, which means basically foreign credit growth in the case of Germany. Now, there are many reasons for Europe's lack of dynamism. I think it's partly due to a suspicion of change, a risk aversion, a pessimism about the future. Strikingly, only 1 in 2 Europeans thinks that one should start a business if there is a risk of failure, as there inevitably is. But I think it mostly captures the capture of government by vested interests who stifle opportunity and who steal the value created by others. So if you see, much of Europe suffers from a lack of innovation and enterprise, cartelized product markets, ossified labor markets, rigged and subsidized land markets, a bloated and often inefficient public sector, underinvestment in productive activities, and overinvestment in unproductive assets, notably property. Face it, Europe's big companies are all old and entrenched, whereas 20 of America's 100 most valuable companies were founded in the past 40 years. 0, not one, of Europe's were. The new giants of our digital world, Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, PayPal, eBay, WhatsApp, Snapchat, they're all American. There is no European equivalent of Silicon Valley. And at the same time, Europe faces ever greater competition from China and other emerging economies. So you see the leading rival to Apple in making smartphones is not a European company, it's Samsung. Or you see the world leader in solar panels is no longer Germany, it's China. And yes, this rapid growth in China and elsewhere is a huge opportunity for Europe, but it also is a huge challenge. So if you pull all that together, you have depressed demand, demographic decline, inadequate investment, poor productivity growth, and weak wages. Europe seems set for prolonged stagnation unless it radically reforms. And depressingly, most Europeans think that younger generations will have a worse life than they do. Now, the present economic pain and fear of the future are poisoning politics too. Social tensions within countries are multiplying, as are political frictions between them. Understandable anger at the injustice of bailouts for rich bankers and budget cuts for poor school children overlaps with a despicable scapegoating of outsiders, notably immigrants. Separatism is strengthening. Just last week, the Scottish National Party, in favour of Scottish independence, got 50% of the vote in Scotland. And Catalans are seeking independence from Spain too. Old stereotypes have been revived and new grievances created. So Northern Europeans slander Southern Europeans as lazy good-for-nothings, while outrageously Greeks label Germans Nazis. Nasty nationalism is on the rise again. Support for the project that binds Europeans together, the European Union, has never been lower. And Britain's, my own country, may even vote to leave. The EU used to be associated with peace and prosperity. Now it's associated with austerity, with recession, with German domination, with undemocratic constraints on what people can do, rather than how we can all achieve more together. And many Europeans have lost faith in establishment politicians, in EU officials, in elites in general, who seem self-serving, captured by vested interests, sometimes even corrupt, and incapable of solving Europe's problems, let alone painting a picture of a brighter future. And this anti-establishment, anti-EU, anti-foreigner mode is fertile ground for extremists and charlatans who did extremely well in last year's European elections. And many of them are economically interventionist, socially conservative, and culturally xenophobic. In other words, they are deeply illiberal. So threatened from above by dysfunctional institutions and disastrous decision-making, from within by nationalists and xenophobes, and from outside by Putin's Russia, our open societies, post-war Europe's most amazing achievement, are at risk. And of course, Europe's problems have broader ramifications. In just 8 years, the European Union's share of global GDP has fallen from 30% to less than 24%. Adjusted for differences in purchasing power, it accounts for only 1/6 of the world economy and China is going to overtake it this year. Simply put, Europe matters much less in the world. There is now, across Europe, increasing controversy over the TTIP, trade and investment negotiations with the United States. But you go to Washington, and business people and policymakers are much more interested in the TPP, with 11 countries in the Pacific. Countries in Africa, Asia, and the Americas that were once drawn to Europe as their main market now look to China instead. And yes, Europe is still an attractive refuge for people fleeing the arc of instability to its south and east. But it's much less appealing for talented migrants, including many Europeans who are looking to move elsewhere. And I'd say that a weak and divided Europe is also encouraging Putin's aggressive expansionism in Ukraine and the destabilizing threat that he poses to the Baltics, the Balkans, and beyond. And a weak and divided Europe is also turning inwards. European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker has declared that the EU won't accept any new members for the next 5 years. Now, what message does that send to reformers in Bosnia, Serbia, and elsewhere? Haven't we learnt the lesson from Ukraine's Orange Revolution, when the then Commission President went to Kiev and said, "Never, ever will you ever be a member of the EU"? And look what happened next. So our message is simple. Europe desperately needs to change. We need to resolve the current crisis decisively and fairly. We need to make radical reforms to re-energize our economies and our politics. In order to save Europe, we need to change it. The starting point is to tackle the balance sheet problems that continue to hold the Eurozone back, and which harm, of course, Norway and other countries by depressing your exports and by creating uncertainty which limits investment. The Europe needs to clean up and, in some cases, kill off zombie banks. It needs to restructure unpayable debts, both private and public. And it needs to boost spending in ways that pushes the economy towards healthier patterns of growth, notably through increased investment, through unleashing competition and enterprise, with Germany and other surplus countries playing their part in the adjustment. Looking forward, all of Europe's economies, including Norway, need to become more adaptable, more dynamic, and more decent in order to create lasting shared prosperity. Now there's the good news. The good news is that since large parts of Europe are so inefficient, they can grow faster simply by copying what other countries do well. And to do that, we need to break the stranglehold that some companies, both big and small, have over cartelized markets. We need to open up more to trade and investment, embrace new technologies, and invest more. One thing would do a lot to close the gap between Europe and America, and that would be to use digital technologies as much as the United States does. As well as imitating what others do well, Europe also needs to innovate more. Start with schools that give everyone a fair start in life, spur creative thinking, and, like Estonia's, embrace our new digital world. Their kids start learning how to computer code age 7 or 8. Create prizes and competitive tenders for research funding. Relax patent laws. Open up to go-getting newcomers from around the world. Capitalize on Europe's biggest resource, the diversity of its people. Create enterprising universities and colleges. Champion risk takers. business angels and successful entrepreneurs. Make it easier to start a business, to grow a business, and to close one. Look on failure as a lesson learned, not a lifetime stigma. And jumpstart finance for risky ventures through both private capital, like America, and public capital, like Israel. We also need to insulate ourselves from financial excesses, to break the power that banks have over our economies and our politics, to eliminate the tax advantages of debt and property speculation, and to build a smaller, simpler, and safer financial system that serves the needs of the real economy and isn't subsidized by taxpayers. Instead of giving handouts to companies through the EU's emissions trading scheme, we should be combating climate change by funding more research and by taxing carbon consumption. And as our societies age and our workforces shrink, we need to open up the labor market to young people and to other outsiders. We need to welcome migrants who can help care and pay for the old. We need to encourage senior work. And we need to future-proof our pension systems, as Sweden has, in a way that is affordable for contributors and decent for beneficiaries. We need societies that provide security while also encouraging people to take risks. One way to do that would be to provide every young person with a capital lump sum that would give them a stake in society and would give them the means to invest in their future and potentially start a business. And we need a tax system that is efficient and fair. So we should stop taxing hard work and enterprise. And if we did that, we would create both jobs and boost wages. And we should shift the burden of taxation onto unearned windfalls from land ownership and from large inheritances. Above all, we need to stand up for those locked out of the system, not in the nasty way that the extremists do, but by opening up opportunities for everyone to get ahead. We need open capitalism, not crony capitalism. Now, most of these reforms should take place at the national level. Europe should be focusing instead on what can best be done at an EU level, completing the single market in services and energy, promoting the development of property-regulated EU capital markets, defending and facilitating the free movement of labor, more vigorously enforcing competition law, reducing the burden of unnecessary EU regulation, eliminating harmful subsidies, notably for farmers and landowners, tackling climate change more cost-effectively, ensuring that help for poorer countries and regions is better spent, negotiating deals that open up trade and investment, preferably through the WTO, and creating pathways for membership for Europe's neighborhood, which is the best form of foreign policy that the European Union has. And to make it all happen, our politics needs to change too. We live in an era of technocratic mismanagement, of narrowly framed policy choices, short horizons, and limited ambitions. Hemmed in by vested interests, bereft of big ideas, most politicians try to muddle through rather than shake things up. No wonder voters are unimpressed. Europe needs bold leaders who are willing to challenge prevailing wisdom and challenge vested interests. It needs political entrepreneurs, new people in society who are willing to go into politics and try and change things. And it needs a grassroots movement for change.
We need to update our closed, clubby, and class-based politics from a bygone industrial age with a more open politics fit for the internet age, more open to new and different views, more open to new people and in how candidates are selected, more open about the funding of political parties, more open about lobbying. That's the only way in which we are going to restore trust in politics. And last but not least, we need a much more open, accountable, and democratic European Union with genuine political choice. The European Council is the only legislative body that takes legislative decisions in secret. Even the Congress of the Communist Party in China takes them in public. We need to recognize that the European Commission is a political body and make it more responsive to political choices. Create a genuine contest for power in the European Parliament. Involve national parliamentarians more in the work in Brussels. Make more use of citizens' initiatives to address the issues that MPs neglect. And experiment with new forms of deliberative democracy that engage citizens in informed decision-making. Stagnation, decline, disillusion, and despair are not inevitable. Europe needs hope, a politics of genuine optimism, a prospectus for a better future. We need a Europe that is open to the world, open to everyone in society, and open to the future and all its possibilities for progress. We need a European spring of economic and political renewal. Thank you.
Now we'll leave the floor to Mr. Andreassen in Swedbank. He will give a short comment to Mr. Legrain.
Well, sorry, take that afterwards. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here, and thank you, Philip, for an excellent presentation or an argument for a change in Europe. I must say, I think I agree with some 90% of your recommendations, but I'm not that sure I agree totally on your diagnosis where Europe stands. If you look at economic development in Europe since the 80s compared to US, GDP growth per capita has been exactly the same in US as in Europe. Europe has been lagging the 2-3 past years. That could be, of course, due to structural problems in Europe that we haven't seen before, and that could really create problems going forward. But still, it might be due to some cyclical arguments as well. Policy has been more aggressive in the US. Monetary policy, lower interest rates until now. We have quantitative easing in the US. Europe is starting up just now. The euro has been stronger than the dollar until now. We had fiscal tightening, not in the European average, but in some countries more aggressive than in the US. We have seen, and I think I agree with you totally on the banking system, but not where we are now. Europeans did a big failure, but not take the banks hard in this first phase of the recovery after the crisis. In the US, banks were forced to recapitalize faster than in the Eurozone, and they were able to work normally again after a much shorter time span. But finally, banks in Europe are now doing better. They are increasing their lending. I think the major point of change was the establishment of the European Banking Union, and the ECB taking the charge of supervision of the banks. And in fact, the leverage in the banks has been reduced, and the equity share has been increased substantially. Also now, finally, too late, but better late than never, in European banks. And now they are lending again. And their ambitions to increase the balance sheet. But it took time, that must be said. And of course, if you look at last year, we have something specific with Europe. We are neighbor to Ukraine and to Russia. And by the way, we have Greece as a member in addition, which US doesn't. But I think both those problems most likely are fading out, both Ukraine and Greece in one way or another. If I take this business cycle or short-term, well, Greece is not short-term, but still is not that large, those short-term explanations for the underperformance since 2011-12, I think they are sufficient to explain what happened. And I'm much more optimistic on what's going on now. If you look at households now in Europe, many of them have paid down debt. That has been, of course, a hard time. When you pay down debt, you have to save and spend less. But last year, or the fourth quarter and the first quarter, we have seen the sharpest increase in consumption in Europe in 10 years' time. In Germany, since unification. Consumer confidence in Europe is at the highest level we've seen in years, much higher than in the US. That's on the average level now. Why the consumer confidence in Europe is much, much higher than normal. By the way, the reason why I came late now was that we got the figures for Norwegian consumer confidence. And guess what? It's not normal anymore. It's low. So I think, and business surveys as well are showing that businesses are getting more confident. I think looking back, what happened and that created the crisis in Europe, as in other countries, was that banks were allowed to, and thought it was wise, to lend money to everybody that wanted to borrow. And high credit growth in many countries. And I think you wrote in the book about, this was not about the government spending too much money in most countries. It was about the private sector in many countries were allowed to spend well above their income levels due to increased debt. At the national level, of course, globally, there is no overspending in the sense that one man's savings and another man's lending or borrowing. But in some countries were allowed to borrow far too much. And it was mostly in the private sector. It was also in the public sector in some countries, like Greece, but that was the exception. But even though the public sector seemed to be doing rather well in Europe before the financial crisis, the underlying fiscal balance was not that good. It was, in a sense, when the private sector was booming due to credit and cheap credit, then you have higher tax revenues and less public spending on unemployment and so forth. So the underlying budget, the structural budget balance in Europe was weaker than it should have been, like in the US before the crisis. And of course, when the bubble burst, there's no way of creating huge harm. And it was mainly done by a huge decrease in private sector spending because it was too high. Construction in Spain fell by 10% of GDP from 18 to 8 over a time span of 3 years. And that, of course, made 1.7 million Spanish construction workers vacant or unemployed. Catastrophe. But nobody could continue on that path after that situation. From when you're up there, it's only one way to go, and it's down. Fiscal policy was too tight in some countries afterwards. I think specifically in Germany. But in some countries like Greece and partly like Spain and Ireland, the deficits were so large and public debt became so high, so that they really didn't have the opportunity to let the government run huge deficits going forward. And besides, nobody wanted to lend them the money. And I can understand why. I think we have spent the years afterwards to both reduce the deficits in the public sector, which has, of course, been a drag on growth when it happens alongside the consolidation in the private sector. But that's behind us. The need for austerity going forward is limited because the fiscal balance is okay. By the way, the Eurozone is now running a deficit at the public sector, 2.5% on average, compared to 5 now, 4.5 in the US and 5.6 in the UK. So the need for tightening is less. The private sector has already build down the debt level substantially in many countries. Banks are starting to work again. And Ukraine is fading as a problem, I hope and pray. So I think the worst is behind us. And of course, it has created huge problems and challenges for policy makers, for the political system. But I think it's understandable that people are getting frustrated, and they have reasons also to be critical versus the way the politicians handle the banking system. They should have done as we did in Norway, kill the owners and let the banks survive and let them go on. They haven't done it yet. They have done it over time, but well, the problems with the banks are mostly behind us, I think. So my view is that I think the economy will create less problems for the political system. And of course, I agree with, as I said, with 95% of our policy prescriptions. I think, well, from a liberal standpoint, I think they are very wise. And especially in this audience, listen to what he says, what they say about inheritance taxes and property taxes. Just remember it. It's a good advice. Not everybody here likes it. I don't think we will see a European spring in the way you are looking for, and I would hope for that it could happen. I think the gradual change will be still positive. We have reconstructed the Eurozone in most important elements of the previous few years because the institutions we had, the Maastricht criteria, the central bank function, the banking supervisory system, it didn't work. And when it didn't work, the Europeans changed it. Of course, after the third crisis meeting late in the night, but every important part of the Eurozone has been changed already. And what's left, I think they can handle. So perhaps because I'm an older man now, that could be both ways, of course. I'm a moderate optimist. I'm a moderate optimist because the past has not been that wrong. The Eurozone, Europe has not been doing that bad economically. And by the way, it's now moving in the right direction. And one final point, I forgot it earlier. Demographics is against us. But one important thing has happened over the previous years, and it's happening now by the day. Participation among old people is increasing like a rocket all over Europe. Over the past 10 years, participation among the 55s to 65s in the Eurozone, in Germany, has increased from 45 to 65%, 20 percentage points over just 10 years, and is still increasing. Participation among women is soaring in many European countries, while it's not in the US. And that with the old people has not happened in the US. So Europe is partly not compensating the fact that we're getting older by letting more or being able to have more old people in the labor force. But there's still more to go, of course, but we're moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now the final comment from Erik Grindheim.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my plan was to say good morning, but I'm not sure after Philippe's lecture whether I can call it a good morning or not. It's rather depressing. And I always wonder why books about crisis sell so well. Why do we talk so much about books about crisis? It's a strange thing. Yes, there are huge problems, deep crisis, and terrifying challenges ahead. Yes, I agree, there is a lack of dynamism in Europe, and certainly there is a risk aversion and vested interests working against change, which I totally agree with you we need. But we have a highly educated population, we have equality between women and men, we have political stability. And after all, I think 75% of the voters on the European elections last year voted for center-right, center-left parties, for the catch-all parties in the middle, not for the extremists. So I don't think that Europe is in neither an economic nor a political crisis. Your analysis, Philip, sorry to say so, it's a typical middle-class stroke academic feeling of angst, anxiety. And I think I was in Palo Alto in 1998, and I heard about all these things, all the medicines you prescribed for us. Then it's well close to 20 years back in time, and I think we've heard it before, and I think there is a lot of truth to it. But I think we need to think even more novel than you do, even more in some different ways than empowering. Get rid of all these vested interests and so on. I agree, but it's not enough. We need a change of the change. So you had 3 points I would like to address. One is that Europe is bad. Well, if Europe is so bad, why do so many people want to come here? Why do we have these people migrating to Europe? It's the same we have about the United States. Everybody says the United States is the worst place on earth. Why do everybody want to live there? That's a very strange thing. The second is, of course, we need to change Europe. But I don't believe in radical change. I think Europe's best invention is stability and gradual change, evolution, not revolution. Although we have had revolutions with fatal consequences. And the third one is that large parts of Europe are inefficient. I totally agree, but inefficient according to what? What's the standard? What is the best economic model? What is the best political system? And what is the best political culture? What's the best practice? Why should we always look to this culture of rapid change, of empowerment, of being economically efficient, and so on? Culture is an important thing. Stability, respect, equality, equivalence between different values, and so on. So I agree that we need a change, and I totally agree with you. Although Magnussen said in the beginning of your lecture, you said, I agree 90%. At the end, you said 95%. I think I go to 85. So. I think we need bold leaders. Bold in the meaning we need leaders who believe in Europe. It's not a surprise I say that as president of the European Movement, but I think it's important to say it. And I think the lessons we learned from the European elections last year, the lesson should be that we should say, yes, more Europe, and fight extremism, nationalism, fascism, and radicalism on the left by saying more Europe. What we need is to work together for a united, peaceful, and I totally agree, modern Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would just start the debate by asking you, Mr. Legrain, to comment on the comments that you got, because I think that it seems you are now accused of painting a more pessimistic picture of Europe. And even though I thought in the beginning that when I read your book, I thought that the things that you are proposing are really bold, liberal reforms, and you got like 85%, 95% agreements, something like that. But would you think it's possible? Are you being naive in proposing these things? And what is the greatest obstacle in doing some of the reforms that you have the support here? And what is the most important change to do? So you could reflect on that and comment on your commentators for the picture that they comment on your comments.
Okay. Well, I'm delighted to have 85% agreement and 90 or 95% agreement. I mean, in politics, that's rare, and therefore I will say that the fact that the comments were focused on the areas of disagreement, you shouldn't take as representative. Clearly, they didn't want to echo the parts they agreed with, and they focused on the bits that they disagreed with. A few points of fact. Of course, if you stretch back far enough, Europe is doing as well as the United States. The fact is, since 1995, productivity growth, which is the basis of higher living standards, there's been a divergence between the United States and Europe. It's been stronger in the US, weaker in Europe. And unless you raise productivity growth, you're not going to be able to afford higher living standards, especially when the productivity of the people working has to not just pay for the people working, but for ever rising numbers of people who are retired. And yes, you are right, it's great that people in their 50s who are perfectly able to work are continuing working. In Britain, that because of the crisis, you're seeing even people 65, 70 continuing working, and to a certain extent that offsets that. But still, don't be complacent about the challenge ahead. We've only just started. The baby boomers have just started retiring over the past 5 years. It's going to be a huge change over the next 15. And I would respond to those people who say Europe is still wonderful. Yes, I love Europe. I love Europe. That's why I want Europe to be better, and I want us to be able to continue to have a wonderful Europe. It's not by being complacent and saying, well, it's been wonderful in the past and we're still great now, that you're going to be able to have a great Europe in future. And I think we shouldn't be blasé about the scale of the challenges ahead. And so when you can point to things which are true, which is, yes, this year is slightly better in the Eurozone than last year, okay, that's true. But you look at the big picture, which is that the Eurozone is doing worse than in the 1930s, that the economy is still smaller than 8 years ago, and you're saying actually the big picture is terrible, and even the longer term picture, which is not just the crisis, but is the past 20 years, we're also underperforming. So I think we need to be much more aware of the challenge ahead. Now, admittedly, Norway is to a certain extent, because of your massive oil reserves, a different case. Though I think you should be worried still about the low productivity in this country.
I must say, the low productivity you quoted is due to decline in oil production, and that's not due to productivity in the real economy in Norway. Take away the decline in oil, productivity is okay.
And that is your ability to be able to afford the standard of living that you have now. And I think it's manifest. You come to Norway and you see that there are some sectors which are efficient and there are some which are less efficient, and the ones that are less efficient have some catching up to do. And that is true across Europe in every single economy, from Britain to Germany, and even more so in Greece. So I say the biggest obstacle is, one, complacency, and two, the huge power of vested interests which want to block change. So you see, why don't we have as dynamic, for example, an internet scene as we do in the United States? Well, one reason is we don't have a European single market. So if you in the US, you start a startup and suddenly you have a whole US market to sell to. In Europe, you only have your local market, but also you have the big established telecoms companies which want to throttle change because it threatens their dominant position. You have difficulties in starting a business and attracting capital, and all those things we shouldn't underestimate.
Thank you. Even though I haven't asked you to sign up, you have already started signing up, and that's really, really kind. So please do. And people sitting behind here, you can also sign up for questions. And I will take one question at a time and tell you when the list is closed. Before we open, I'd like you to comment on something that's in the papers and in the debate and will not disappear for, I don't think on the short term, maybe not in the long term. You open up for one of the solutions is to say that in the aging population, we need migration. And what we are seeing now is a huge migration that we are really not in a position to tackle for the moment in the Mediterranean. So I'd like the panel to comment on that, and you may sign up. So maybe you'll start again, Mr. Legrain, on commenting on the policies for the I'd say catastrophe in the Mediterranean right now.
Well, I mean, clearly what's happening in the Mediterranean is tragic, that thousands of people are drowning on Europe's doorstep. And I think that at the very least, we need to have an enhanced humanitarian effort to save people rather than allow them to die. More importantly, the bigger picture, though, is that the idea that migration is a threat rather than opportunity is simply not true. I mean, migrants have a huge amount to contribute to Norway and other European countries, whether it is as innovators, as entrepreneurs, as people doing the jobs that local people don't want to do, as taxpayers, as carers for the elderly. And while you're right to say that part of the solution to demographic change is that people should work longer and you can increase
labour market participation, actually some of the countries in Northern Europe that face the biggest challenge actually already have very high levels of female participation, for example. So the idea, you can't get that same benefit that you can elsewhere. Migration is a key part of the solution, not all of the solution, but a key part of the solution.
Okay, Andreassen.
Well, I read your op-ed in the New York Times some few days ago. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah, really astonishing to have such a voice in the European debate. And you wrote about the experience from Israel. How many % did that population increase in that?
It increased by, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it increased by 15% in 8 years.
Yeah, sure. And it has created some problems with the borders of that country versus the neighbors. That must be said still. But I think a society is able to adapt to a much larger change. And to people saying that in Norway, we don't have place for more people. It's filled up. Did you look down when you came in? It's not, of course. We have plenty of space. But I think I don't have any answer on that, the catastrophe going on in the Mediterranean. And I accept that societies in Europe not today are not able or not willing to take on a huge number of refugees. Of course, many of them might contribute nicely to their society, and both in all ways. But it must be said that in some countries in Europe and in Norway as well, well, if you look at the immigrants, they are not the same as coming to the US, for example. And economically, they might be a larger burden than, let's say, in where the best and brightest go. So I think there is a mix of measures, both in North Africa, helping those people getting out on the water. But I think it's unlikely that we are willing to do what you encourage us to do, to open up the borders. I don't think that's the viable option today politically.
Okay, Jan Erik.
Yes, I think if you look at the economic figures, countries with open borders and high immigration fare quite well, economically speaking. But it's also in these countries where you have strong political opposition. It's amazing to see how right-wing populist, quite hardline parties grew in the European Parliament election last year in Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, Austria, and the UK, all doing quite well, in fact, amongst the best economies of Europe. So that's interesting how probably then welfare societies, high-growing societies fear immigrants, even though it's, I think, like you say, immigrants boost the economy.
Thank you. I think we will have the questions now, and I probably have enough of you on the list already. So if they are really short, maybe I'll have the time for some more questions, but I'll tell you the list is closed. Lars Peder Nordbakken.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that I think Grein's book is one of the most hopeful books about Europe written during the last years. Really a hopeful and critical book at the same time. I think there's a connection there. One of the great strengths of your book, I think, is that you are pointing, in analyzing Europe, you're saying that Europe is not only facing a cyclical problem, it's a structural problem. It goes very, very deep into the very dynamism of the economies. And on the other hand, of course, the dilemma, the political will and the ability to do something and to convince people that there really is a need to change seems to be nowhere, seems to start nowhere. So is that, I would like to ask you, do you see any hopes that there is a political awareness is growing to do something, at least in the liberal parts of Europe? What's your comment about that?
Okay, so the question is, do you see a political willingness of understanding the crisis and doing something politically in the liberal parts of Norway to the situation that we have? I mean, the understanding of the crisis and then the willingness to do something.
I think that most political leaders in the moment in Europe are scared of making big decisions, of making bold moves. They think that they'll be punished by voters if they do.
and they don't have the courage of their own convictions, which is why, I mean, perhaps there are politicians that I'm not aware of who are making those, who are saying those things. At a senior level, certainly the ones that I met in my time at the European Commission, there weren't very many of them. So I think you need to have many more people going into politics who want to change things. I think we have a class of professional politicians who are good at managing things, or just about okay at managing things when there aren't big decisions to take. But when you do need to make big changes, you need people who have a vision and people who have courage and who are people who are willing to fight for change. And I think the situation now in Europe calls for that.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll have the next question, and you will be able to comment on that. That is the gentleman over there.
Just one quick question regarding immigrants. Is Europe getting the immigrants that we need to deal with these problems in terms of skill levels, in terms of willingness to be integrated into those countries to which they come? Or is that considered by you to be a problem? Then comes the more fundamental question. It appears to me that to deal with all these problems, basically, you need a strong, decisive government that can take bold steps. That at the European level. That to me points in more integration of social policies, of labor market policies, of fiscal policies, and so forth at the European level. In other words, a move toward the United States of Europe. And it appears in the real political world that the movement is going exactly in the contrary direction. That is to say, in your own country now, you want a looser union with more national autonomy. That to me seems to pose a big fundamental question that does not make me very optimistic, quite frankly, about the future ahead.
Thank you very much. We have two questions. One, are we getting the immigrants that we are searching for, with skills and knowledge? And the other one is quite fundamental. If you are looking for a strong government, European government, for instance, the elections in the UK now makes us wonder what is going to happen when the Brits are going to vote yes or no for the EU before 2017. So maybe you might just also put a comment to this fundamental question on the elections in the UK, and you may also comment on that. You start, Mr. Legrain.
Well, I think Europe needs all sorts of different migrants, and that governments aren't best placed to decide who they need. I think that if you had a more sensible migration policy, for example, like Sweden, previous government brought in, where companies can hire workers at any skill level from anywhere in the world, on 2-year renewable visas, that companies would be able to attract the workers that they need. Second of all, you need to make better use of the people who are already there. There is a kind of view, for example, that accepting refugees is an act of charity. It is, but they also have a lot to contribute. The refugees who make it to Europe are often the most talented and highly skilled ones, and their children even more so. And there's a tendency to treat them as if once they've got here, you don't expect any of them. And I think that's harmful for their personal development, and it's also harmful for society because they get treated as a burden rather than have something to contribute. And I think that attitude needs to change. It's prevalent in the Nordic countries of seeing, aren't we good people? We're allowing people in as refugees. Yes, you are good people, but also once they get here, make good use of their talents. In terms of EU integration, I think it's quite funny in Norway being criticized that Britain isn't committed enough to Europe when you're not even in Europe at all. But, well, I'll let that pass. You're right, there is going to be now a referendum on Britain's membership of the EU in 2017. It's going to be a hard-fought referendum. I suspect that it's going to divide the Conservative Party, that it's going to be difficult to win. I would say
it's probably a slightly more than 50% chance that Britain will stay in, but lots can happen between between now and then. And a lot of it depends on how well the Eurozone is doing and whether Europe seems like something attractive that you want to be a part of. In terms of whether more integration is possible, I don't think it is at the moment, because even before the crisis, there wasn't enough support to move forward with closer integration. As a result of the crisis, these new grievances and tensions have been created. People don't trust each other anymore. And the idea that you could solve all that by leaping to a European government, I think is actually dangerous. The idea that Greece and Germany could be run by the same government, I think, is a bit crazy.
I think you could just follow up on that, because in your book you wrote about the euro and the eurozone and the three possible futures for the eurozone, where a Germanic eurozone was one technocratic one, and then the federal was the other alternative, and the last one was the flexible one, which is a little bit about this sovereignty that we are talking about. You might just fit in a comment for that as well.
Sure. I mean, you're absolutely right that, as an economist, I will tell you it makes much more sense to have a federal eurozone. We know that federalism works well as an economic system. It works in Germany, it works in the United States, it works in Switzerland. So, or an economist or a political economist, except that, there isn't the political support for it. So how then could you make the eurozone work well without creating a common fiscal authority? And I argue you ought to go back to a more decentralized, flexible eurozone, which means restoring the autonomy that governments have over fiscal policy, along with the no bailout rule, which was breached in 2010, with two crucial differences. One, you need a mechanism for dealing with financial panics, and secondly, you need a mechanism for dealing with sovereign default, and we don't have those, or at least the last one.
Okay, Grindheim, you'd like a comment?
Yes, well, there was one question about the immigrants. Do we get the immigrants we need? I see your point, but I think that's one of the good things about Europe. We don't ask whether we need you or not. We open our arms and we say you're welcome. And I think that's that equality, that all people are equal, is a very important thing in a democracy. The second point is, Philippe, you said the politicians are punished by voters. I don't think political opposition is a sign of crisis. It's a sign of a well-functioning democracy. I think it's good that we have opposition in Europe. And I think when we see these people opposing the system as such, it's a good thing. It shows that Europe is a democratic political institution.
Thank you. We'll have a next question over here.
Hi, Linda from the Conservative Party. You're having questions now on migration from different angles. I'm glad to hear you still think of migration as a solution to the aging population, but how to deal with the large-scale immigration we see of unskilled laborers. You have commented a bit on that, but you have the housing, jobs, integration, language. And in Norway, housing is a great problem, because you can't just live on the street in minus 20 degrees. And you also say that a lot of the immigrants that are coming do have a high level of education. I know we have people in the party that are Syrians that are trained as dentists, but as a Syrian dentist, you have a total different training than as a Norwegian dentist. You cannot use your skills here unless you take the education once more. And how do you see that with the technology shift that where they say that we will lose 40% of the jobs today, we will lose in 10 to 20 years? And for Mr. Andreassen, Legrain wanted a shift from taxing hard work and companies to taxing property and inheritance. So we know about the property debate and taxing on that. But this government, they has removed the inheritance tax, and even the Labour Party said that they won't reintroduce it, as they saw that it didn't make a huge difference on the budget, and it targeted the wrong people. Do you think, and it looked like you agreed with him, do you think that Norway has a population of inherited rich that could make an impact on the budget, and that we could reintroduce inheritance tax? And please don't interpret this as anything. And if so, how?
Okay, there were two questions, starting with the immigrants and saying that they might come as unskilled, or even you might have skilled immigrants being a dentist, a Syrian dentist, but you cannot use your education in Norway or in any other European country. What will that make when you have also a labor changing market that will probably make it even harder for unskilled workers to get work? And the other one is taxing questions that you are writing about in your book, taxing properties and taxing inheritance. And the specific question here is, do we have enough rich people to reintroduce the inheritance tax in Norway or, well, anywhere in Europe? I guess your proposition here is for the European taxing system. And you also might sign up for comments.
Well, you asked rather a lot of questions about immigration. I think that you pointed to a genuine problem, which is in some cases migrants have valuable skills and those qualifications are recognized in this country. And then clearly that ought to be a focus for government action, that in order to make best use of the people who are here, that they can do courses to enable them to quickly achieve a Norwegian qualification, enabling them to practice here. And it is a waste of their skills and indeed bad for Norway if they're reduced to driving taxis instead. Though even then it might be a rational individual decision if they think that's a means of achieving a better life for their children. But I think it's also a mistake to think that we only need skilled workers. That's just not true. I mean, you see countries that only let in skilled workers. Canada's a very good example. And you see this consistent de-skilling of people because actually there is a demand for unskilled work too. And put simply, you know, Norwegians with higher education levels or higher aspirations or simply aren't willing to do increasing numbers of difficult jobs. And the biggest one of that is the fastest growing area of employment growth in Europe is care for the elderly. And that's only going to get bigger. I mean, you look at the numbers of over 80s and people who are most likely to need care, the numbers are going to soar. And yes, you could go the Japanese model and have old people cared for by a robot. I don't think that's an attractive option for most people. Yes, you can open care homes in Spain. I know Norway's done a bit of that. And that's nice life, but also you're far away from your family. So I think a key part of it actually is having care workers here in Norway. And in terms of shifting, nobody likes paying tax, but there are taxes which harm things that we think are good, like hard work and enterprise. And there are taxes which reduce things that we think are bad, like pollution. And then there are taxes like taxes on land, which is an ideal tax because land increases in value not through the effort of the person who owns it, but through the growth of society as a whole and the investment of the government in infrastructure. And therefore, in order to pay for lower taxes on work, in order to pay for lower taxes on enterprise, and therefore in order to make everyone else richer, shifting the burden of taxation onto land is the ideal tax. Adam Smith said it, David Ricardo said it, Winston Churchill said it. It's the ideal tax, and it's the way of paying for, as I said, lower taxes on labor and lower taxes on enterprise.
Thank you. Any others? You have Andreassen?
On property taxes in both US and UK, you have much higher level of property taxes than we have in Norway. Well, I just wanted to provoke you on the property taxes and inheritance tax. I don't have a program for the latter one, but we in many countries have taxes on estate taxes or inheritance tax. And I think it's although one of those taxes that really don't harm the economy much. So I think that's the reason for having it. The reason why it failed was that we were not able or willing to put a real value on those assets that people had, and it was unfair, much like the wealth tax we have in Norway today. But if I cleaned up that first, I think there could be an argument for having at a moderate level an inheritance tax in Norway as well. I come back to the economic things afterwards.
I'll just like to make a comment. I think we still have an inheritance tax, but it doesn't work like it did. So it is better now, but the system is complicated, but it's working much better.
And I said a tax on large inheritances.
Do we have it? Isn't it abolished totally?
It is about the value of the property that you are leaving from one generation to the other. It's much better now, so you are getting taxed, but when you sell things. So,
but you don't have a tax when you die.
No, it doesn't. No, but when you sell it, you have.
Well, as Mark Twain once said, "Buy land; they don't make it anymore." So I think that's.
But they made quite a lot of it.
But I think if you need the money, Heidi, you should. I agree. You shouldn't tax hard work, but you need to tax people if you need the money to run the welfare state. I think. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have one last question, and that's here.
European movement. I would like to address a question concerned with the increasing separatism in Europe. And you remarked, Philippe Legrain, that, well, I interpreted that you described increased separatism as a negative feature in the European picture. But when you look at the European integration project, to a certain extent there is some logic to it, because you have strengthened the supranational level and increased the local or regional levels. So my question is it necessarily a negative thing, the increasing fight for more autonomous regions in this context? Because it could somehow stimulate maybe what you're looking for, the new political boost, new people, new ideas, maybe dismantling the rigidity of the national state and all those structures.
That's a very good question.
Yes, shall I probably repeat it first? So you'll. It's increased separatism, and it's probably seen as something negative. And the question here is, could it be positive, making people participating democratically by showing interest in their own region, and could that stimulate to something? So, Legrain, you can answer that.
Clearly, it can go either way. What I was saying is it was symptomatic of the increasing social tensions and political frictions that exist. So if you go to Scotland, a lot of the movement for Scottish independence is based on resentment of the English, and likewise, you go to Catalonia, you go to Barcelona, and it's resentment of Madrid, resentment of politicians in Madrid. So I would say it was symptomatic of increasing social tensions and political frictions. Now, I respect the right of national groups to seek independence, and clearly throughout history, we've seen an increase in the number of nation states. I fear, though, that the new nation states that would be created would be inward-looking ones rather than outward-looking ones. If you go, I know Catalonia quite well, you go to Barcelona at the moment, and the idea is not so much that we're going to be independent and open up to the world, it's that we're the best, we don't need Spain, and we're going to turn inwards. And you look at Scotland at the moment, there is a feeling that also of turning inwards. So I think if you said to me, this was part of, we're trying to break out from a big country where we don't feel our voices listened to, and what emerges from that is a confident, positive nation that wants to contribute to the world, I'd say, yeah, that's fantastic. If, on the contrary, it is a symptom of, we are angry with the way that our affairs are run, we're blaming it all on foreigners or on the people in London or in Madrid, and we're going to elect a bunch of politicians who aren't necessarily going to be open and outward looking, then I think it's different. Now, but, of course, I mean, Norway's history shows very well one can split away from a larger country and turn into a thriving democracy. So, and likewise, Ireland from Britain. So it can go either way.
Thank you. I think I look at the watch here and Mr. Grindheim is leaving us shortly, but I think we'll have 3 more comments or questions. So if you'll be really brief, just formulate your questions. We'll take those 3 and we'll sum up by having your comments. So first it's you.
Hi, I'm Campbell. I'm the European Union ambassador here, and I'm British, as you can hear as well. So this is a debate I've heard many times, I believe, on the way Britain and Norway are views on the European Union. So just to say, the EU-European debate, I think, is alive and kicking here. But to be brief, my question was actually to come back to the issue of trade. You touched on trade. TTIP is not on the agenda here, and I'd like to hear very briefly your comments on that in the current context.
Okay, and the next question is over there.
My name is Fakra Salimi, and I'm working with the Mira Center. It's a resource center for migrant women. And I think I would first like to say something about migration in Norway. Norwegian welfare state is built on the migrant labor, because Norwegian migrants were imported to Norway to build the state at that time. And I think if you look out, the people who are working on the street right now, 99% of those workers are migrants from Europe and other parts of the world. So I think that migrants are doing a very enormous contribution in this country. The problem is that we are talking about migrants, skilled migrants coming and not getting jobs, but there are so many migrant kids, young people who are engineers and doctors today who are not getting the proper jobs here. There is lots of discrimination and racism in the labor market, and that has to be addressed, this thing. Secondly, I would like to ask, thank you very much for a very nice presentation and analysis about Europe, that Europe is also seeking markets abroad. And there they want to have freedom and openness from Asia, from Africa, South America. But why is this so much skepticism of Europe when the others want to have that kind of open access to Europe and European markets?
Thank you. And the last question, you may just be very short, it's over there.
Me?
Yes.
Hello, my name is Hans-Erik Olav. I would first like to say thank you for a very nice speech. As far as I'm concerned, you're speaking to the choir. Europe is absolutely broke, morally, socially, politically, economically.
Can you formulate a question, please?
Yes, I will. I would like to ask you, since I don't have much time, I would just like to ask you to go to the root problems I see, and that is the role of government. Too much centralized government, too much bureaucracy. The only way we can get things in order is to actually reduce it. Can you give me your opinion about that?
Thank you. Then the 3 questions quickly summed up like first, trade. Then the second, get proper jobs when you have qualifications, migrants. And the third thing is centralized government and bureaucracies. I asked Grindheim first to comment on those things that you'd like to comment, and then for both of you to prepare your last statements, including the comments that you'd like to make on the questions. Mr. Grindheim.
Yes. Will I also have my final comment?
Yes, yes.
Good, thank you. Well, I think the first question on trade, I think TTIP is a very good idea. I strongly believe in this agreement between the US and Europe because it's a very broad and deep agreement. It's a partnership. We are have mutual recognition of standards and so on. So that's a very good thing. Secondly, qualification. I think one of the problems, it's not only when you come from Syria that you have to re-qualify in Norway. When you come from Denmark and Sweden, you have to. So we have a problem of accepting other people's education in this country. Centralized government. Well, I don't think it's that bad. But of course, you should always be skeptical to centralized government and power. That's about democracy. Well, my final comment is that I hope your book will sell well.
Okay, I think the publicity is really made here, so you'll sell a couple of books here, Mr. Legrain.
And I also agree that complacency and vested interest is a lethal combination, and it's against change. I love Europe, and I love Europe to change to stay Europe. But I think we should stop being so masochistic about ourselves, because I think we have a quite good model of society, a good political culture. And I think what we see in the Mediterranean, the way the Italians, after all, have tackled the huge problems we have seen has been very, very good. I think we need to help Italy. So that's my final comment.
Thank you very much. Then Mr. Andreassen.
Short answers to the questions. I like trade. I like the system to integrate migrants to the economy, and I agree with you that there are large proportion of the immigrants are contributing, of course, to the economy. Then my final comment. I think my starting point was quite simple. If you look at the figures, they're not that bad. GDP per capita in working age in Europe rose faster than the US until the mid-80s, and in line with the US after that time. And we have a much better development, in fact, on the labor market in Europe over the previous 10, 15, 20 years than in the US. The participation rate has been declining in the US and is now quite low. In Europe, it's higher. Of course, some problems are struggling because they made so many stupid decisions and helped by bankers in other countries, like Germany and France and others, moving or killing those economies with wasteful investments in construction. Disaster. And they're struggling, but that fight is behind us. And since growth has been okay, look at corporate profits. That's my job, at least my colleagues. Earnings per share has been doing perfectly all right in the European companies. They are not bad companies. They're not bragging in the same way as they do in the US, but still they are kicking the stone and saying, "Oh, it's not good at all." And we complain as much as we believe it because we don't look at the figures. They're not that bad. Average productivity has been slightly worse in Europe, but that has been compensated by a huge increase in participation in the labor market. So I think the starting point is not that bad. And the Eurozone has been able to change. All important part of the Union has been changed since the crisis because the model they built before it was based on an assumption what happened couldn't happen. And when it happened, well, shit happens and they changed the model. So the Stability Fund, banking union, everything was established. I think Europe needs change, as all countries do over time. But Europe is changing, and not too much of that is based on policy. Of course, really stupid economic policy systems are really bad. But take a give of the really stupid ones. In the middle, it doesn't matter that much. Much of it is based on entrepreneurship, on what businesses are doing, what people want to do, and we're not doing that bad. So with gradual changes, I haven't decided, I haven't counted your list on policy advices. I think I could vote yes for most of them, and I hope some of them will be implemented. But the major thing is that a gradual change could be sufficient even in Europe. It's not as bad as you said, Ulo. It's not. Look at the figures.
Thank you very much. And then your final comment, Mr. Legrain.
Well, I have looked at the figures, and there are even more in them in this book than I mentioned in my speech. I think the figures are actually worse than you say. And by aligning the 1980s with post-1995, you're mixing up a period when Europe was doing well with a period when Europe is doing less well. And I think the Eurozone performance has been truly catastrophic. In fact, you can just look at the evidence. It's the worst performance of anywhere since the 1930s, and in some cases worse than the 1930s. In terms of trade, which is a very important question, I mean, I used to work as Special Advisor to the Director General of the World Trade Organization. I'm a multilateralist by inclination. I think that global free trade is better than regional free trade. That said, a free trade agreement with the United States is better than nothing, and therefore that we should be pursuing it. I am not particularly optimistic about the likelihood of concluding it. First of all, because I know very, very clearly when we launched the negotiations, it was a time when there was no growth in Europe, and we were looking for a way of having some good news that didn't cost us anything. So we said, oh, well, and the US agreed to launch the TTIP negotiations. But very rapidly, it became clear that the United States was not that interested in TTIP. And you just need to go to Washington. You even speak to people in Congress, they don't even know that TTIP actually is going on, which tells you that the chance of having the political momentum to conclude it on the US side is quite low. On the EU side, we've seen that a whole range of people have decided to oppose it for all sorts of reasons, whether it is the investor-state dispute settlement, whether it is fears that it's going to lead us to have dangerous American food, or a lowering of regulations. And I think on the European side, there's more skepticism than before too.
And if you think the next year is an election year, and therefore if we don't get it done this year, it'll be put back till 2017 or 2018. I would say that the prospects for TTIP are not particularly good in the short term. The lady talking about the contribution of migrants. I'm sure you're right to say that there is discrimination against migrants in the labour market. I think it's also the way that labour market institutions work. If you have a labour market which favours insiders at the expense of outsiders, then outsiders, whether they are young people or migrants, tend to do badly. And that is true even if there is no discrimination at all. And therefore, I think that having labour markets that are open to everyone is important. And in terms of the role of government and bureaucracy, I think clearly government can play a positive role and a negative role. People have different views about the appropriate size of government. By my standards, I find the Norwegian government rather large, and the taxes here rather high. But if you're part of it and you are a beneficiary of the spending that it provides, then perhaps you might have a different view.
Thank you very much, and we'll give an applause to the panel.